Now, the difficulty we have now is that this is eating us. This is eating us because the requirement of reconciliation is that we're partners. It doesn't mean much more than that, really. It means that we look at each other and say, let's work together. In practice, the requirement of justice still is that we're enemies. And the ambivalence of this community is that, and so we are, and it really draws on your point, which is, it's not that we haven't done anything about the past. We've probably tried everything. We've had Sentence Reviews Commissions, we've had HETs, we've had the Ombudsman, we've had the inquiries, we've had the Victims Commissioner, we've got the Victim Service, we've got everything. We've got an absolute ton of mechanisms in there to do bits of it. But the deep resistance is ultimately to anything which challenges this, and more importantly then takes us back to the fact that this process of truth-telling, now the political parties want to maintain these stories, which was, this is the story of we are the abused and we need to defend ourselves, we are the abused and we need to defend ourselves. That's what those stories are. And the process of truth-telling, I'll say it blunt and then I'll probably pull it back, will so humiliate both unionism and nationalism that they'll no longer be able to continue. And they know it, actually. They don't know it, but they sense it. I think so. I think it leaves us all in a place that's quite hard to go to, which is kind of slightly silent with each other, which is that, and it's not about drawing on equal lines or some kind of easy, you're the same as us, because it won't be that either, but it will be deep disquiet in everybody, which absolutely has to start, which is that inhumanity in this community was not confined to one side or the other. Yeah, shame, yeah. And from that point on, you have a possibility of facing your victim slightly differently, because the shame is a different one. It is, all of these people were sacrificed to our inability to find an alternative. All of these people were sacrificed to our inability to find an alternative to this. Our only way to justice was this. The only way to what we called justice was this. And justice looked like defending yourselves. And for 100 years we've done it. And we're going through 100 years of memorying about this. And the peace process, if we want to drill into it, asks really big questions about whether that was these were wise in Ireland. It really does. It doesn't say they were bad people. It just says, something from where we're looking at, we have to revise our views of these things now. Both of them. We have to revise them really deeply. We have to say, we understand that human beings did them in those times, and we probably might have done them ourselves if we'd been there. It's not about that. It is nevertheless true that we have to take into account what has now happened to us, and we have to say, do we want to continue with this, or do we want to find something else? And that's not about standing in some massive top-down judgment on all the people who did it. What is really, really clear to me, after all that sentence review work, is how, even in the worst cases, how really tragic a lot of the engagement of the individuals who got involved in that actually is. That there's not just a talk down story, there's a tragedy story about being brought into this stuff because you thought it was heroic or because you thought it was the best thing to do. And some of them have gone through experiences where they know now, looking back, it was just a disaster. And a lot of them individually can't live with it. I went to a thing where I, just recently, which Costa did, about mental health and ex-prisoners. And there's nothing so similar to mental health in victims as mental health in ex-prisoners. The parallels are gigantic. Gigantic. You just have to look and you go, my goodness, the only other group who has a mental health history like this and a drink history like this is this alcohol abuse, drug abuse, suicide, all of these things, very high levels, depression, all these kind of things across the board. And they're very, very similar to the victims. And it's to do with, you can't get loose of this ambiguity. You're living with this ambiguity, heroic or awful, heroic or awful, heroic or awful. But also for the victim. So I do think, and now we come to the bit which I was asked to talk about, which is, so what do you do in this circumstance? What do you do in this circumstance? Well, I don't know. This is me talking, so I don't know what you do. But my sense is we have to struggle for some place in which this story can be told in a way which exposes the vis-a-vis relationship. That the bit that's missing is how these things connect to each other. And we are creating storytelling processes which are not story hearing processes. I need to get to the point where it's extremely clear to me that what happened to the Ballymurphy families was terrible, even if I'm a unionist. I need to get to the point where I recognise that what happened to, the people in Enniskillen or whatever vote you want to take was terrible, even if I'm a Republican. But it does ask questions about who gets punished, who are the judges, who gets punished, how do you do because my own personal feeling is the more you unravel this, the more the question isn't was it bad, the question is who's in a position to do the punishment here and what is the nature of that punishment. Because if it's the British state, we'll just set the thing going again. If it's not the British state, people will say there's a whole load of people getting off a blue murderer who killed my action. So one of my ideas was, would it be possible to, you'd have to do all these things by inquiries and commissions and all this kind of thing, but I mean, what we've done in Eames Bradley is they teased it out, they kind of pulled the wool out a bit of the ball, kind of saw some aspects of it, but it's still piecemeal. Because we need to know somewhere at the higher level of narrative where it is we want to go. If we want to end this relationship, if that's what the purpose is, how do we stop doing this to each other? Then then part of that is it's the question of what do we see that makes that difficult? What do we see then? What are the things we need to hear about? But part of me says, you almost need to say, who could we find to be the judge? Now, human rights, and I was interested in your discussion of human rights. Human rights was the attempt after the Nazis to try to create the international frameworks around that kind of thing. The difficulty in our situation with human rights isn't human rights. It is that because human rights was designed to do something very important, which was to hold states to account, because they're the biggest violence in the room always, to hold states to account. If you don't watch out in this kind of scenario, what it looks like is holding this leg of the violence to account without holding this leg of the violence to account. Do you understand? In other words, that it ends up on this side looking like it's a collusion with your story about who are the good guys and who are the bad guys. And my question is, how do you honour what human rights is about? Which is saying there must be a right to life and there must be a right to liberty and you cannot do this, there must be something. How do you do that in such a way that we are all held to account to that question? Yeah.
I think all the things you've said there are about the fact that in a way we're in a Cold War process, I would say.
Yeah.
But it actually, it's the models of state that are at war, and human rights truncates, or states truncates human rights. So all that there.
Yeah, nationality truncates human rights.
1916, but all states go back to the original violence that created the state.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think where this takes us is that we have to go. We're at the point in human history where it's not about Northern Ireland, it's about this planet.
I agree.
So that's where we have to go. We have to go out of this we have to use this context to jump out of history, out of local history. Without
making us more,
history, so
yeah, without making us more big-headed. the thing that we have a chance to influence, for me, is exactly that. And it's for two reasons. One is because we're so wealthy, we didn't collapse. So that actually is our duty, because people say, where are the other models around the world? You go, actually there aren't any, but there couldn't be, because actually none of them had the advantages we had. We're at the top of the tree in terms of advantages here. So we need to get a bit serious about that. The other one is because most conflicts are less equal than this. Therefore, the narratives very quickly descend from one side to the other. Do you understand? It's either the state is so horrifically intrusive on people that you can just identify immediately that all the problem lies on that side, or the other way around. The violence is so massively on one side or the other that you simply have to look at it and say, you know, something has to be done. But there is a narrative which can be constructed which says, because of this, because of that. Here, what is exposed is something much more raw, which is, even if, and here's the really difficult part, even if you're right, they started it. Even if you're right that they started it. And that maybe even if you're in, even here, go another way, even if you're right that you couldn't see any other alternative to grabbing to violence, because we'd have to be as honest as that, we now, in the light of what we know, have to change. Because this exposes what can happen and how violence works between us in such a way. And so the question of the future and how we open the future is, in a sense, and here's the really difficult part. I'll just finish with this one because I see the other groups sitting there outside. But the really difficult part of this one is, we are so long in this that our identities are almost negative identities. In other words, we're not them. And so this process of finding ourselves, we will lose ourselves in this process. We will lose who we understand ourselves to be. We have to reconfigure. And so the leadership issue in politics isn't simply how do we deal with the past, it's who is reconfiguring a possible future. This is where the Nelson Mandelas of this world become really, really important, because what he does is not simply talk about the past, he reconfigures people's identity into something else. He says, look, there's another possibility and another relationship we can have. This is your Martin Luther King moments as well. These kind of people carry something not simply in terms of what's going back, but actually some kind of gateway into the future. And the difficulty we have at the moment in, funny enough, and therefore, and it's almost a problem now, things like the Queen going to Dublin are really, really obviously massive in terms of Irish-British relations. And Higgins is going now back and that'll all be sorted now. But it's sorted for those states. We, inside this little 6-county zone, still don't have our moment. I mean, we have them sitting at corners. See, that was fascinating, that. Remember when Paisley and McGuinness went into power and they had to discuss, would they sit side by side or would they sit opposite each other? And they decided they'd sit in corners. I think that's so brilliant, because it's the ambivalence of Northern Ireland. If you sat side by side, you'd look like you were friends. If you sat opposite, you'd look like you were enemies. So we sat in the corner. And that's where this community still sits. Ta-da! Finish of talk.